The Consulting Success podcast is powered by the Clarity Coaching Program. If you'd like to work directly with the Consulting Success team and receive personal coaching and support to optimize and grow your consulting business, marketing, and revenue, visit consultingsuccess.com to find out more and apply.
Welcome to the Consulting Success Podcast. I'm your host, Michael Zapersky. In this podcast, we'll dive deep into the world of elite consultants, where you'll learn the strategies, tactics, and mindset to grow a highly profitable and successful consulting business.
Hey everyone, it's Michael Zapersky, and welcome back to another episode of the Consulting Success Podcast. Today, I'm here with Susan Lindner. Susan, welcome.
Thank you so much for having me, Michael.
Yeah, I'm excited for our conversation today. For those who aren't familiar with you and your work, you are a storytelling coach and a consultant, a keynote speaker. You are an entrepreneur because you've run multiple companies, and we'll get into all that. Today, you are the founder and CEO of Innovation Storytellers, which is a consulting firm that helps companies to communicate more effectively with their ideas and kind of get those ideas out there. And you worked with organizations like WeWork, AT&T, GE, a whole bunch of others. And I know there's probably a lot more that you want to add and maybe even correct something that is there about your companies. Anything that I need to adjust there, or does that kind of cover at a high level?
Yeah, that's great. I think of the work that I'm doing is helping turn innovation experts into incredible storytellers so that they get the resources and the runway and the recognition that they deserve, because so often they do not. Right.
Well, so I love that clarification that you just made, because you said something there that I think really is important just to kind of like put a bit of a spotlight on, which is innovation experts. So we'll talk more about that, because that to me makes it sound like you're very targeted in who you want to speak to and who your ideal client is, kind of work that you're doing in terms of help people to tell their stories or bring their ideas to life. That's applicable to almost everybody on earth, or at least a lot of people, but you've been very selective. And so I want to get into that. But before we do, I think we need to start with kind of how you got to where you are. And the way that you were introduced to me and kind of recommended to come on the podcast was, hey, like you have to ask Susan about her time in Thailand, because she was doing something very different from consulting. So you were actually working as a field epidemiologist in Thailand, seeing people dying from AIDS. And you didn't know, this is kind of thing what I've heard, and maybe from our research, you didn't know how to communicate how deadly this virus was, or this disease was, I should say, at that time. And you really wanted to make sure that people who were at risk could know about the danger of this. So if you could take us back that time, what was going on? What were you thinking? And how does that kind of connect to the business that you have today?
Well, for me, it's a very direct line. Other people don't necessarily get it, but for me, it's inescapable. So I'll take you back to 1994, northern Thailand in Chiang Rai province, which is right on the border with Myanmar. At that time, 1 in 6 sexually active people were HIV positive where I lived. There were 3 AIDS funerals a day. And the red light district that I was charged with working in had already gone out of business because most of the sex workers and many of their customers had already died.
Wow.
So given capitalism what it is, where there is supply, there is demand, and a new red light district opened. And my job was to begin to understand. Everyone was very clear what HIV was and how people were dying. No mistaking that. The challenge was, how do we get people to use condoms? There were no medicines available at the time. Clean syringes were not an option. And I was in the Golden Triangle area, home to opium and heroin use. And those were not readily available. And so the condom was our first line of defense. Now, I work in innovation. So we love tech. We love new tools. We love all those cool things. If you were to guess, Michael, how old is the condom? As a breakthrough innovation technology, how old is the condom?
Oh, wow. You're putting me on the spot here. I would just say, like, my mind was going 1950, 1930. I have no idea.
I'm going to ask you to look back further. I did a double check with ChatGPT earlier today, just to double check my facts. I had been saying 10,000 years first noticed in the Grotte du Carambel in France, in the caves of France. There are paintings on the walls. We don't know if that is a public health message or if that is bragging from somebody's fantastic night from the night before. But 10,000 years, it looks like, is the first evidence, human evidence of the condom. But apparently some were just found in a recent excavation in the pyramids in Egypt. And so I might have to check that carbon-14 dating on those condoms. But yeah, this is a tool that's been around with us for a very long time, and it clearly wasn't working. And the Minister of Public Health at the time was creating these very terrifying posters that basically had a scary, hungry ghost depicted on it with the words in like dripping blood that said, "Get AIDS and die." That fear campaign was actually quite effective for about the first 6 months, and we saw a drop in infection rates. But about 6 months later, those rates came climbing back up again. And so we did what any good marketer would do. We doubled down and made scarier posters and billboards, which were horrific. People with symptoms and people dying literally on the posters. And that worked too for a couple of months. And then they started climbing again because human nature believes that if I smoke this cigarette, I won't get cancer. And if I eat that triple cheeseburger, I won't become obese, right? That's just our nature. We want to believe it's not us. So we needed to find a different way. And in my mind, we needed to change the story, both that the sex workers, the customers, and the brothel owners were telling themselves, and the new stories that needed to replace them. I'll just say I was really dedicated to this effort. My nickname where I lived was Condom Girl because I would go jogging in the morning and hand out condoms in the market, like over breakfast, just handing out condoms to people. And I worked in a restaurant at night called Cabbages and Condoms, whose effort was intended to make condoms as ubiquitous and easy to talk about as cabbages. And you could pick up a handful of free condoms on your way out of the restaurant. So it was a social enterprise, needless to say, run by the nonprofit where I work. So we needed to switch the story. And as an anthropologist, which is my background, we did some ethnographic study. We did some questioning of the brothel owners, the customers, and the sex workers to ask them what would get them, how did they feel about their current state of being and what empowered them in their current state? How did they feel about their motivations for owning a brothel, going to a brothel, or working in a brothel? And the mama-san, of course, said she was interested in making money. And the customer said they were looking for a good time. And the women and men who worked in those brothels said, I just want to survive. And so most of those sex workers were seeing 8 customers a night. 8 times a night for anybody is pretty challenging. Using a condom every single time without fail is almost impossible. And so when we flipped the script and asked the question, how could you become the hero of your own story? The mama-san would then say, I would make sure that I had the cleanest brothel so that people would feel safe coming here. And the customer would say, I want to be the protector of my family. I want to make sure I don't bring HIV home. And the sex worker said, I want to be in charge of my own destiny. That would make me use a condom every single time. And so we wound up turning prostitutes into entrepreneurs by teaching them. And again, this girl from the Bronx, right? Chicken raising, pig raising, duck raising, secretarial skills, computer skills. Some things didn't work out, by the way. Hairdressing. In Thailand, you lay down flat on a table and get your hair washed 3 times. It feels amazing. But there's too real risk of customers coming in and wanting more than a haircut with that hairdressing. So we had to nix that because our hairdressing school wound up turning into a mini brothel. But gem cutting and gem polishing, Burma and Thailand are phenomenal places with a wealth of stones. So we turned women into gemologists almost without that expertise of understanding the gem. But in any event, that wound up dramatically dropping HIV infection rates because everyone was motivated by their own self-interest and they could become the hero of their story. And so learning that and being armed with that shifted how I went to work then as a consultant in the PR space, helping small businesses, like helping startups really begin not just talk about their cutting edge technology, but also how it was going to have a dramatic impact on their customers. What would the transformation look like? And that's when I started, after a short stint at the Centers for Disease Control, tracking variant and resistant strains of HIV coming to America. I wound up joining the .com revolution and working in a PR agency with .com startups.
So yeah, very powerful story. Then there's a lot to unpack there for our listeners that are tuning in, because they're thinking about, well, how do I take this and use it to help me to build my consulting business and get to that next level? I think one of the questions that people might be kind of pondering on right now is, okay, this makes sense. I know I need to better understand what desires or what drives my ideal client. I need to figure out how do I make them the hero. But for people who maybe aren't sure how to get that information, like ultimately you're kind of talking about identifying what people care most about at the core, right? Not the surface level, but like really understanding what resonates with them, what would get them to take action, what would get them to say yes to having an appointment or right, sitting down, having a conversation. How do you suggest that people do that? Let's just say you're sitting with a friend right now who's a consultant and they want to meet executives in tech companies. They want to better understand what is top of mind for those people, what their challenges are right now. How do you suggest that people go ahead and do that if they don't have, let's say, a big budget to conduct studies and do that kind of work? What have you found, or how do you kind of think about that kind of an activity?
Yeah. So as I'm thinking about like my 3 target audiences, as I think about my customers' target audiences, I ask a couple of questions. So number one, first of all, my technology is the least interesting thing at the table, or what I am selling is actually the least interesting thing, but rather their problems are the most fascinating. And we've heard it 1,000 times, fall in love with the problem, never the solution. You'll be in business forever. But how often do we get really curious about what it would take to actually make that person a hero if they worked with me? So I would ask a consultant, okay, consider you have the opportunity to work with target market X, right? So big wig at X company or CEO of a middle market company even. How is their life going to get dramatically better on the other side of working with me? I'm not just talking about, I'm going to put 10 new leads in your inbox, or I'm really going to shape the outcome of a particular challenge you might be facing, but what's on the other side of it? So oftentimes I'll use a phrase like, the consulting work I do really helps executive channel their leadership abilities. And the key phrase here is so that.
Mm-hmm.
So that you can go on to do that next thing. And that is a mindset shift, and it's neurological shift when we create goodwill. All that work in Thailand was about creating goodwill. And by goodwill, my definition is the act of making someone else's life better.
Mm-hmm.
The target market we're going after. Do we actually know what would make their life better?
Mm-hmm.
And do we know once our service is inserted into their life, how their life would become better? Raises, promotions, they get to go home at a decent hour. They get to look like the hero in their own business. They get to solve challenges more effectively without the burnout. What would that transformation look like in terms of making someone's life better, not just their bottom line, not just their department's bottom line, et cetera? Do we know the answers?
And so when you've identified what those things are, let's say you have a hypothesis, or so it might come from conversations, it might come from some research that you do. However you get it, right? You have kind of an indication or a belief or a hypothesis about what people care most about, what their desires are, and so forth. What do you then do with that? Like in your experience, right? You help companies to essentially develop their stories, or right, more effective ways of telling their stories. How do you take that information about the problems that somebody's having, the desires that they have, or where they want to make improvements, and then actually bring that to life? Like, what are the next steps from when you take or identify that idea into actually turning into something more than that?
So is the question, I'm still trying to land the meeting? Like, how do I use it?
I mean, it could be. Sure. So yeah, I mean, it could be in that context. I guess what I'm wondering is like the process here. It sounds like the first step is really identifying or better understanding what your ideal client cares most about. Once you have that information, what do you then do with it in terms of about developing it into a story? And then do you weave that story into content? Like, I just want to know kind of how do you go about from that initial stage one to all the way to putting it to market and so forth?
Yeah. So I want to turn up the volume a little bit on that need, that desire. And something about working in life or death situations is, how do I make it life or death for the person that I'm connecting with? Here in New York, it's kind of a violent place, but we ask the question, where is my customer bleeding from the neck? And that creates a sense of urgency and importance. So it's not just enough to like, yeah, I'd like to get home by 5. Okay. But like the sense of urgency is, because if I don't, X will happen.
Mm-hmm.
So maybe that's the add-on. So the way that I go about from a marketing standpoint thereafter with trying to talk to a client is to understand how to diagnose the problem from its most minute to its greatest. And then I begin writing stories about that progression based on past clients or things I'm seeing out in the world. So one example is in my line specifically, and to your point, I've chosen a very narrow niche. I work with innovation teams because that's my joy. I love being 3 to 5 years ahead of everyone else in the room and knowing what's coming next.
Yeah.
But I also find innovators are oftentimes struggling with their communication, more so than folks who have an MBA attached to their name because they're so dedicated to their science or their discovery or whatever it is that they've lost that connection to how the rest of us communicate in a way that's exciting.
Right.
They think we just get it, like most of us. And so, for example, there's one that's quite topical. I'm sure many of your listeners probably saw SpaceX and Elon Musk's newest rocket that exploded. And I'm writing a blog post on this right now that Elon Musk congratulated his team in the face of that failure because the thousands of victories that went into making that failure is epic.
Mm-hmm.
And so sometimes we forget about congratulating Edison on try number 9,000 with still another 1,000 tries to go.
Mm-hmm.
And so a tolerance for failure is something that is absolutely critical in the innovation space. So I might identify all the little steps along the way and write stories about my clients or what's happening topically that I can bring to a conversation with an innovator that says, I get innovation culture. I get what failure looks like. I get how painful that is and the ribbing you have to take from other members of the C-suite. And I want to help be a consultant to help your teams better communicate both the failure and the victory. Where can we start?
Okay, so I'm going to take a stab at kind of summarizing a bit of what you just mentioned, and hopefully this helps others as well. So it sounds like you start off by getting very clear, like the processes, get very clear about what are the pain points, the bleeding neck, the desires, just like really understanding how your ideal client thinks and everything that's going on inside of their life as much as you can.
Yeah, we say context before content, before I even sit down to write a story, right? Context first.
Okay, and then you kind of slice that up into little pieces and find ways to tell a story, share a case study, bring something from that's newsworthy into your content that addresses each one of those little things. So if it's Jane wants to be home by 5:00 to be with her kids, or Tom wants to be home because he's never home and that's going to really affect his relationship, like you would identify like whatever that case or situation might be, and then create content around that kind of one little slice, put that into the world. And you do that for every kind of little slice, so that one, you're really resonating with the specific person you want to make an impact on and ultimately become a client. But also you can pull in, believe I heard you say, pull in those examples to share with people or to bring up in a conversation, because now you've kind of covered the gamut of everything that is likely top of mind specifically for them. Is that kind of a good summary or anything you want to add to that?
And because of that, you wind up getting top, middle, and bottom of the funnel too. When people are still just investigating, you're like, damn, I would like to get home by 5.
Right.
Or, wow, I really wish I didn't have to create 60-page slide deck to get my point across. If I could get that done in 10 slides through better storytelling, then I could actually get home by 5, right? Now I can go back up again. And then what's it really costing me? Am I not getting a raise or a promotion? Or am I not getting my incredible breakthrough idea or my project through to approval from the board and the team because I'm not effectively communicating at the board level and it's costing me my job? Now I'm tying into those two professional goals, personal and organizational, that is driving things at the bottom, people who are just about to close. So that's how I think about how storytelling functions for me and how I communicate with my clients, but also how I teach them to communicate. What are my spheres of influence, that those concentric circles that I need to keep influencing with story to bring them on board, to get them to work at 110% capacity with my cool new thing when I'm still just need to hit my quarterly goals.
Okay, I want to dive into your business in just a moment, but before we do, I want to try and help anyone here that it might be struggling and that's currently thinking, yeah, like I understand how powerful stories are, but there's nothing interesting in my life, or it's hard for me to, like, I don't really see anything to talk about. How would you counsel somebody like that? Because I'm sure you've run across a few people like that in your years of doing this. Where do you suggest that they look? How do they kind of navigate or shift that mindset away to be able to actually see all the opportunities around them?
Okay, so let's recall one thing. We only learn in 2 ways. We learn by story. Honey, don't touch the stove, it's hot. Or we learn by experience. Holy crap, my hand's on fire.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Unless you're getting divine intervention, right? And someone's planting a brilliant idea from upstairs into your mind. Those are the 2 ways that humans learn, story and experience. You think about your experience at school, you got a lecture and then you went to lab and you got to see it play out. So this is the way that humans learn. Now, one other thing I want to remind you of, the benefit of story is memory. which is a productivity device for anyone in the room. So if there are any skeptics on the storytelling side, Stanford did a study that found that just giving people facts, which is sometimes as consultants what we do, I call us seagulls. We fly in, we poop a bunch of data onto a prospect's desk, and then we fly away again and hope that they get it.
Mm-hmm.
They don't remember it. They don't retain it. They are certainly not able to communicate it back to their boss to hire you. So story is a memory-making device because we add things like emotion that trigger all of these fantastic neurotransmitters in the brain that make a story stick. So for anybody, and we can dive a little bit more into that if you like, but to your question about, do I have a story to tell? The answer is, of course you do. Just recounting your day to your kids and your family or on a phone with a friend is storytelling. How do we find story? Okay, this is fantastic. So most storytellers start with your basic 4. So those are people. So people who have had an impact on your life positively or negatively. Places, a place that triggers a great emotion. So, and great means voluminous emotion, intense emotion. So it could be the beach or the mountains, like every dating profile says, or I like the beach and the mountains. It could be a haunted house. It could be your moldy smelling dorm room. Those things immediately conjure emotion and memory. So people, places, events. So maybe it's moving out. Maybe it's going to college. Maybe it's an illness. What is an event in your life? Christmas. And then the last is objects. So treasured objects. It could be that ice cream you had 3 scoops high that you took your first lick and it fell on the sidewalk. Or maybe it's your first driver's license or your first car. So those 4 will always trigger, if you can think about a pivotal person, good or bad, your bully or your favorite teacher, places, events, objects. That's where we typically start and where most stories start.
That's awesome. So for anyone that might be feeling challenged, to create a story, or you just don't think there's one inside of you, I'd recommend creating maybe even just a little kind of visual of that, of the people, places, events, objects, and use that as a bit of a prompt to help you to, recall something that fits into one of those kind of boxes and start from there.
I can give your listeners like an easy framework because a story is not the Iliad. A story can be 4 sentences that could really change someone's life. So once you find that thing in business now, think about a story that you might tell and then tie it to a theme.
Mm-hmm.
So what's the theme that's going on in your prospect's life or even in your own? Maybe it's perseverance, resilience. Maybe it's growth. Maybe it's innovation. So think about what that theme is. And then the next, if you were able to take that, oh my gosh, I failed my driver's license test 4 times, but I persevered and I finally got it. And then I got the crappy 1988 Mazda that was handed down from my older brother, Greg. But it gave me the freedom that I never knew I could have before, but it would never happen without persistence. Easy story. Now I can take that persistent story and talk about what's happening with my team and how we get through if it was COVID and work from home and layoffs and whatever else comes through. But those are the bridging steps. And then the way you make it really shine is emotion. So if we don't talk about the struggle of how hard it was to get that license and recognize with empathy how challenging it is when you're surrounded by layoffs and we're the team that's left, and we can do this. When we begin to harness emotion and the empathy of the person sitting across the table from us, we can tell amazing stories.
Yeah, I love that. So people, places, events, objects. Then once you have that story or kind of your theme, you connect it to your business, your work, whatever you're focusing on, and then make sure that you're bringing in emotion, empathy, so that you're connecting on the feeling side as well.
And then one more thing I'll add to it. So the big 3 questions as you finish writing your story is ask yourself, what do I make sure when I'm done speaking that people know what to think? They know what to feel because you've put the emotion in them. You decide if they will feel innovative or guilty or enraged or inspired. That's your job as the storyteller to input the emotion. And then what do you want them to do? Because if you want them to do anything, emotion is the catalyst to get someone off their ass and actually doing something.
Yeah, love it.
So we all act based on emotion. We create momentum based on emotion, not on logic.
I just took some notes there because I'm going to start using some of this good stuff. So I appreciate it, Susan.
Hey, it's Michael here, and we'll be right back to the podcast. But first, are you ready to grow, scale, and take your consulting business and marketing to the next level? If so, our Clarity Coaching program may be a great fit for you. You'll work with our experienced team to set up a strategic plan for your business and coach you step by step in areas like how to consistently attract more leads, develop a magnetic message that resonates with your ideal clients, strategically package and position your services, earn higher fees, win more proposals, and scale your business. To find out more about Clarity Coaching and apply, go to consultingsuccess.com and click on coaching.
Okay, so let's shift a little bit to talk about your business, because in the research that we do with all guests to kind of get a better understanding of your background and what you're doing right now, it seemed that speaking is a big part of your business.
Yes.
So talk to me a little bit about speaking and how are you using it to grow your business? Is it something that you are doing right now as a revenue generating activity, where the focus is to maximize revenue of speaking in terms of your business revenue? Or do you look at speaking more as a way to just get in front of potential ideal clients and then generate projects from that, or both, or maybe something different? How do you kind of think about speaking and its role inside of your business right now?
So I would say I was the world's worst professional speaker when I first got started doing this back in maybe 2015, 2016. And I say worst because I spoke to 600 companies for free before I realized that you could get paid for it.
No, you weren't the worst. You were just the most charitable.
You know what? I should have written all of those off as expenses. I could have used a better consultant for my accounting, clearly, at that time. So I had a public relations agency, well, PR, marketing, social, and branding called Emerging Media. We're a small agency, around 15 people. We were doing really well. And I started speaking in order to attract more clients. We're traditionally non-native English speaking startups, meaning international startups that wanted to make their mark on the US market. That was the focus of my business at the time. So I would speak at consulates and at international groups about messaging and PR and branding and so forth to bring in new clients. And it was really effective. What happened was I found out I enjoyed speaking more than servicing those clients after a while. And so I thought, And sure enough, one day I was speaking at the Belgian American Chamber of Commerce, called Belcham, here in New York. And someone came up to me after my talk and said, we could really use this kind of thinking at GE. And I said, do you think GE has budget for a speaker? And she looked at me like I was the biggest idiot on the planet and said, yeah, GE has cash. And so with that, I scored my first corporate client, and they flew me to Zambia to speak to maybe the top 20 soon to be C-level executives in the company. They were flown in from all over the world for a learning trip to Zambia. And the night before my first big corporate workshop, the head of HR leaned over and said to me, hey, our next speaker after you isn't going to get in for another 3 hours. Do you think you can pull out about 3 more hours of content? I was like, sure, absolutely. No problem. Was up all night in my hotel room in Zambia, adding slides and adding workshop activities. And it was great. It was amazing. I was on cloud 9 and I thought, this is really what I want to be doing.
So quick question on that. When you were back in the day, before you had reached 600 charitable free speaking gigs.
You're so generous, Michael.
How are you landing those speaking gigs? Like, do you just reach out to the Belgian American Chamber Embassy or whatever and just say, hey, this is what I'd like to talk about? Or was it relationships, connections? Like, how do you go about getting those kinds of opportunities?
Yeah. So in some cases, I would reach out directly. But there are other groups I found, incubators, accelerators, specifically targeting startups and those that targeted international startups. And they knew about my work because I'm very nichey. So there are very few PR people that I knew of at the time that spoke 5 languages, that was an anthropologist, that had a background in working with international startups. I created connections to venture capital firms that funded international startups. They would turn me on to folks at the consulate or in other groups. They would have me come and speak with their portfolio companies. And then there were specifically for-profit companies that were doing what I called entrepreneurial tourism, that basically brought startups in for a week, exposed them to the New York startup ecosystem. And I was one of 10 speakers during the course of that week. Yeah, that's how that worked.
Yeah, it's a classic kind of bit of hustle, bit of being in the right place at the right time. And then just the fact that you were showing up allowed you to then start to get more and more. It's like you're just building momentum, right? As that snowball kind of gains steam.
Yeah. And building an ecosystem. I was really good about keeping in touch with all those people who created speaking opportunities for me and coming back and saying, when do you have your next delegation? When can I come in again? How are things going?
How often were you doing that? So let's say, I mean, a lot of people right now are sitting on this database. They may or may not necessarily use a CRM, but they have people inside of their kind of their ecosystem, but they're not necessarily very intentional in following up with them, checking in, asking those kind of questions. So what were you doing and what have you kind of found is the best practice for you in terms of how often you're touching and reaching out to people?
So touch points. I wish I could say, obviously, by my serious business acumen of giving away services endlessly for free, I can't say I really had like a timing methodology. I just insatiably curious, Michael. It's pretty annoying to some people. And so I always want to know what's going on. So I was seeing everybody's calendar and would just be like, hey, I see you're having a fill in the blank startup night, or could I come give a talk? They're like, yeah, sure. And I also went the extra mile. I didn't just stand up in the room and talk. I created a slide deck where I really thought about what do startups really need to know and put that together and made it entertaining and made it fun, made it multimedia. Like I put the effort in so that that talk became really honed. I don't think I would have gotten that opportunity with GE if it was my first time around.
Sure. Yeah. Makes sense.
I knew where the pauses were. I knew where I had to brakes. But to your point about marketing, because I did own a marketing agency, was constantly liking and following back people on Twitter and LinkedIn at the time, getting into messaging people over LinkedIn and saying, hey, I'm giving a talk next week. Can I come and speak with your audience too? Or I would say, I'm coming to San Francisco. I wasn't. But then I would reach out to 6 or 7 different organizations and they say, sure, come and give a talk. We'll gather the startups in our accelerator. We'll gather startups from the consulate or the chambers of commerce. International chambers of commerce were a huge opportunity for me because they wanted the business side. And also the grown-ups wanted to start sounding like startups. This was a shift that happened about 10 years into the dot-com boom. So around 2008. And so I started getting, when I would speak at conferences, it was, I need to turn my battleship into a speedboat. How can I sound like these guys? I'm like the sweaty guys in the hoodies and the jeans, the coders who don't leave their desks. I'm like, yeah, them. I'm like, oh, we could do that.
So you ran your previous kind of PR, marketing, social companies, you said, I think for about 17 years or so, had a team of about 15 or so people. And then in a couple of years ago, right?
Just last year.
Yeah, last year. Okay. So last year, 2022, you rebranded, right? And you kind of went a bit of a different path. So I'm interested, I'd love to hear from you on number one, why the rebrand, but also why the shift in business model, because today you are a solo consultant business operator. You do bring in 1099s and contractors on an as needed basis. That's a big shift in model and going from 15 people to 1, essentially. Walk us through why you do that. What was kind of going on?
Yeah. So I got a little tired of Monday morning, someone coming into my office and saying, Susan, can I speak with you privately for a minute? Not just needing to solve my clients' problems, but also needing to help on my employees' challenges. And so who needed a day off, a raise, who was pregnant, who needed to get to rehab, who needed to get to whatever shift it was, kind of became exhausting as part of not wanting to be in this service business in this way anymore.
Mm-hmm.
And to be doing the work rather than overseeing the work. And I have no problem doing sales. I actually love closing new business. That invigorates me. But the people challenges were really not my favorite. So that was one. Number 2, I didn't want to be in the PR and marketing world anymore. I wanted to be on this other side. And I liked corporate. I felt like I had been doing startups for so long. Part of me could do it in my sleep, but working with Fortune 500, Fortune 100 companies and tackling global workforces, staffs of 40,000 people at a time, localizing messaging and storytelling around the globe, because a story that hits well in New York may hit very differently in New Zealand or in Nairobi.
Sure.
And so the anthropologist in me was craving like this multicultural kind of opportunity on a big scale.
Yeah.
And to also see personal transformation among scientists whose work I found was so fascinating and important, and helping turn them into better communicators was fantastic for me. So those shifts were important. The other is COVID hit. That was a game changer for everyone. And particularly for me personally, we had the lockdown the week of March 17th. The week after, every single speaking engagement and consulting engagement I had canceled
Mm-hmm.
or postponed.
Right.
So I think I lost 60K in revenue that second week of the pandemic.
Do you think you would have made this shift from 15 people to one if COVID had not happened? Like, were you already going in that direction?
Oh, I was already there. I had changed that by 2018.
Whatever you're comfortable sharing, but how did the business itself change kind of from a revenue margin perspective? Like, I'm wondering, did you have any concerns going from we're making X amount right now with 15 people and things are getting done without my direct involvement in terms of delivery? It sounds like you're obviously being pulled in a lot of different directions, but to any concern of, am I going to take a big pay cut, or how's this now going to work if I'm just me essentially doing a lot of stuff initially, of course, contractors, but like, what was the shift in mindset and what did you actually kind of see or experience as you went from 15 people just to one?
I experienced my stress level dropping dramatically and a reduction in overhead, which brought me incredible calm. And I started working when I was 13 years old. I lied on my working papers and said I was 16. And so I've never not had faith in my ability to bring in a paycheck.
Mm-hmm.
So I wasn't worried about that. GE was my test case that I could do this and that people wanted this content. And now it was just my job to go out and sell it. So I didn't have a fear about that. It took me a while to figure out what to do exactly. I had gotten to the point where I was done with doing PR. I had reached my threshold. And so I knew there wasn't going to be any ongoing work there. I didn't know that I could do public speaking as my primary revenue generator for a while. And my sister actually talked me out of it and said, "What are you, crazy? You're ridiculous." She goes, "I don't even know who you are without your agency behind you. I don't know who you are." And she goes, "You have 2 kids who are about to go to college. Don't be ridiculous. You'd be a fool." And I listened to her and I was miserable for a year, miserable. And then I just said, screw it. I can't do it anymore. And I just said, I'm going to put all my energies in it. And so I did. But yeah, I listened to my naysayer sister. She had all the best intentions in mind, but
yeah. What's been the biggest challenge for you as you've made this transition and maybe even in the last year or so, aside from COVID? Because I mean, everyone, you kind of went through that in one form or another, but if we put COVID to the side, what's been just the biggest challenge for you inside of the business?
So not just for me, but my clients as well, is churn. So it was amazing when COVID hit, how quickly innovation teams were being slashed. It's like, we need to focus on the block and tackle right now. Our industry is just hitting quarterly returns. We don't even know how we're going to do that. I was like, it's probably your innovation team who knows how to pivot better than anyone. You should talk to them. But that wasn't my decision to make. And it's actually what started me creating the podcast, because there are all these amazing innovators who are helping big companies to pivot, and getting their expertise out into the world was part of my motivation for starting the Innovation Storyteller Show. And in fact, it came about before the thought of rebranding. So the podcast came first. And so having more and more innovators on the show, I kept learning what they were doing and wanting to share that expertise, and then being able to take that and then go and share it, incorporate it into the storytelling work I was already doing. And so the decision to rebrand and the decision to go after this market was very focused because, number one, I thought they were getting really short shrift in the C-suite. Number two, I thought that I could help them, and I didn't see anybody else doing this work. So I know when I am the only person in a niche, I get to own it. I get to brand it how I want to. And I also get to charge what the market will bear, because there are very few people who are doing this work.
Yeah, I love that perspective. Many people have the exact opposite, which is they look at going more narrow, specialized, and focused as giving up opportunity. And I love how you just talked through that, because your words were all about how by narrowing in more, you're actually creating more opportunity. I think is fantastic. Are you okay for 2 or 3 more questions before we wrap up?
Yeah. Can I just share one thing where I actually learned that? So I have a mentor who always says to me, you got a niche to be riche. She goes, once you get known in one thing, then you expand. And I follow that advice deeply. But I actually heard it in practice from a YouTuber who talked about, she was very shy at work. She was responsible. She was an engineer building robots, and she was terrified about failing in front of her colleagues. And so she started a YouTube channel specifically to make robots that don't work. So she'd have all of her failure out on YouTube. This way she could actually be a professional when she got to work. and it wound up blowing up. Her first robot was kind of looked like one of those like those helmets where you have like two things of beer on either side that you can drink from, like a hard hat, but it was actually trying to make you brush your teeth. So it had like a toothbrush and toothpaste, and she's in the mirror trying to brush her teeth and the toothpaste is going everywhere and it clearly just does not work.
Yeah.
But her ability to own this niche made her one of the biggest YouTubers at the time. And she said, I was in a niche nobody else wanted to be in. That's why I'm the number one expert in robots that don't work. And I was like, that I can do. I could be an expert in stories that do and don't work.
That's a great example, a great story, and a great perspective. All right. So a few just quick questions here. We'll wrap up. I'm wondering now, you come across as somebody who is thinking about growth and development. You're not just sitting still, even though you meditate, all that kind of stuff. But in terms of the business now, as a solo operator, founder with contractors, how do you think about growth? Like for you, where are you looking right now to achieve greater growth inside of your business? And I know that for different people, growth means different things. So it's not only about making more money. Maybe it's about more profit. Maybe it's about more time. But for you, just how do you think about kind of scale and growth, given that you have, some may call it a constraint, that there's fewer people than you had before? So how do you think about that?
Yeah. So I look at my business and I kind of always use the palm of my hand. So like the core of my business is consulting. So I go to large. So if I look at the palm of my hand, that's where the bulk of my cash comes from. And then these 5 other fingers are where I think about kind of spreading the wealth. So I do workshops and breakouts, right? I do keynote speeches. I have just started creating this innovation storyteller studio, which is kind of like a masterminding program where people can bring their stories once a month and have my expert guidance and also the wisdom of their peers to do just that. I look to expand my business by doing executive intensives, by bringing innovation leaders around a table and sharing their stories of what they need to tell the CEO of what's coming next, some of that strategic planning. And then the other is I'll say I'm expanding my reach beyond my typical Fortune 500 client. So I am now working, for example, with the World Bank, and I'm writing the innovation story for the country of Serbia. So I'll be writing the stories of how Belgrade is going to become the biotech hub of the Balkans. I'm working on training at the WHO and hopefully the Air Force soon. And so I'm looking at my client base as shifting as who are the masters of change and who need to become masters at the stories around change. So anyone who is invoking change is innovating. And I want to help them with their story to make that more palatable, because nobody wakes up wanting disruption for breakfast with their Cheerios. So we got to make that spoonful of sugar help the medicine go down. And I think that's what a story does.
Out of everything that you do, what's maybe one thing that you feel gives you the upper hand or just gives you the edge in terms of, is it listening to podcasts, reading books, interviewing people? Where do you tend to allocate your time in terms of this something that's like a non-negotiable, that you know that you need to do this to help you just perform at your highest levels? And it might be a personal thing. It might be like having a green smoothie in the morning or meditating, or it might be something else completely different. But what do you do that you feel is just really core to the success that you create?
Listening. So as a storyteller, the number one trait that you have to possess is being a great listener. And I think it's one thing to be curious and ask smart questions, which I think most consultants do, but really taking in what you hear and not just hearing the words spoken, but the emotion behind it is so critical for me to be successful in terms of helping my clients really communicate very technical information, very emotive information, and very impactful stuff that we can't see the ripples for many, many years, especially for products that might not be out for 3, 5, even 15 years from now. So I try to fine tune my listening skills more than anything else.
Love it. All right. And then the last 6 months or so, what is one book, can be fiction or nonfiction, that you just really enjoyed and you'd recommend to others?
Well, I'm a devotee of Napoleon Hill's Think and Grow Rich. I'm on my 8th read and I run a mastermind for the Black National Speakers Association, specifically on that topic, but I'm just pulling up my Audible so to make sure that I get the name right. So I would say probably the book that I'm reading right now, which is Tiny Beautiful Things, which is written by Cheryl Strayed. She is the author of Wild, the movie with Reese Witherspoon, where she hikes the Pacific Coast Trail. but she just put out a book, which is also a movie on Hulu right now. It's a collection of advice columns where no one knew it, but she was the respondent to a column called Dear Sugar. And the way that she responds to people in the most empathetic and down to earth and sometimes in your face, frickin' figure it out way is reminded me that you can have a strong hand and a warm heart at the same time. And so I strongly encourage anyone to read the book or to check it out on Hulu right now. It's just phenomenal.
What was the name again of that book?
Tiny Beautiful Things.
Okay. We'll link that up in the show notes as well. So Susan, before we wrap up, one more thing, which is very important, and that is how can people learn more about you and your work? Where's the one place they should go?
Yeah. So I would say come to innovationstorytellers.com. There you can find the podcast. You can find all of my blogs on how to become a better storyteller. And I'd love your feedback. I'd love to hear from your listeners about how I can help and support them on their storytelling journey, because we're all storytellers, Michael, for sure.
Yeah, we'll love that. Thank you again so much for coming on. Really enjoyed our conversation.
Me too. Thank you for having me.
Thank you for joining us on this episode of the Consulting Success Podcast. For more episodes and to subscribe, rate, and leave a review, head on over to iTunes. And if you'd like to develop consistent lead flow and a highly profitable consulting business, learn more about our coaching programs at consultingsuccess.com.